Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Our subject today involves Central America, particular emphasis on Nicaragua, and the activities have been going on there for some time. We have a qualified person to speak to that subject in our guest, Mr. Lawrence W. Reed, who is an economist, an author, a columnist, and the former executive director of the Center for the Study of Market Alternatives in Caldwell, Idaho. The center is a private research and educational organization devoted to advancing ideas of free markets, private property, and individual liberty. Our guest is also chief economist for James Blanchard and Company of Jefferson, Louisiana, which is a large precious metal mutual fund and investment advisory firm. Mr. Reed has been chairman of the economics department of Michigan's Northwood Institute. He also was a candidate for Congress of the United States from the 10th Congressional District of Michigan in 1982 and is the co-founder of a Colorado-based publishing company. Larry, we welcome you to our program. We're happy you've been with us on campus, and we look forward to the interview.
Thank you, Tony. My pleasure.
I'm happy for the very first time to welcome to the panel Michael J. Miller, who is Director of Media Research at North Idaho College, and I must say does an excellent job as the technical director of the program that we've been producing here for some years. At this time, I would invite Michael Miller to commence the questioning.
Thanks. Mr. Reed, every recent national poll that I'm aware of confirms that the majority of Americans do not support the Contras or the destabilization of Nicaragua. And yet, even for the minority who do, it's getting harder to understand the Reagan administration's policy objectives in the region and how continued support for the Contras can help us arrive at those objectives. Could you speak to those concerns and help clarify what our policy objectives are and how continued Contra activity will ensure that we arrive at the goals?
Well, it's not surprising that the polls show what they do. There was a poll taken after the hearings in Washington on the Iran-Contra affair in the summer, which indicated that even after all that publicity, between a third and a half of Americans could not place Nicaragua on the map in the proper region. I mean, there were great numbers who even thought it was in Africa somewhere. There's still a great deal of education that needs to be undertaken on this issue, and it's been difficult in part because there's been such a massive disinformation campaign waged by proponents of the Sandinista regime. Now, I'm not here today to, as a spokesman for the administration policy, but I do support it in its broad outlines. That is to say, in terms of support for the Nicaraguan democratic resistance, I certainly favor that. And in my belief, if that support is not forthcoming, if Contra aid is defeated, and that's the end of it as far as American support for the freedom fighters is concerned, then we will find ourselves with a Marxist-Leninist expansionist tyranny closer to Houston, Texas than Washington, D.C. is to Houston. And that's something for great concern. And if Americans understand the situation in those terms, then we find that they're supportive of Contra aid, but they don't understand it typically in that context.
Larry, I know that you went into great depth with our students today concerning the situation prior to the Ortega government and now. And I do want to preface this by saying that we're taping this program in December and it will air in February, so there may be developments after your comments. I would like for you to take some time on the program that we have now to give us a background of the previous government prior to Ortega and some of the, I guess would have to call it a far-right military dictatorship, and then the Ortega government is certainly a leftist government and has also been involved in suppression of freedom of the press. I guess I have a two-part question. One, I'd like for you to take some time to explain how both those governments were not democratic in their approach to the citizenry. And then number two, I would like to follow up with a question on how does one from outside who's a powerful country interested in the democratic process try to encourage a democratic government that's not on the right or the left?
Okay, the dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza goes back to the mid-1930s. And for 45 years, there was a kind of family dynasty of the Somoza family. First, Anastasio Somoza I, and then for a time one of his sons, and then later the one who was ultimately overthrown in 1979. So for 45 years you had the same family basically running the show there. Sure, it was a dictatorship. I hesitate to use the label you've used, Tony, to say it's far right. Certainly it was anti-communist, but in the minds of many, when they hear the word right or right wing, they think, well, it must have elements of capitalism about it. It must have been what I would call some kind of a free economy. And it wasn't that at all. It was a dictatorship in which the Somoza family made sure that certain friends and favored others got monopoly privileges, and nobody on the political right who believes in freedom and free markets would favor that. So it was a dictatorship, but it pales in comparison to the present one. And you'll find that kind of sentiment in Nicaragua today very widespread. I have yet to meet a Nicaraguan who will say that I liked Somoza and I wish we had him back. You don't find that. It was a broad-based, popular uprising that overthrew him in 1979. But you'll find a lot of people who will say, as bad as he was, this regime under Daniel Ortega, the Sandinista government, is even worse. And by virtually every measure, you can prove that it is. In terms of the degree of tyranny that it has imposed upon the people, Somoza basically left the Mosquito Indians on Nicaragua's east coast alone. Ortega's regime has been uprooting them, and it has spawned by its violent actions against that regime, against those Indians, quite an Indian uprising against the Sandinista government. Somoza did not go after the Catholic Church to the extent that the Sandinista government has, expelling priests, shutting down Catholic publications, closing down Catholic radio, drafting seminarians into the military, and causing certain others to simply disappear. This has been a massive campaign that the Sandinista government has waged, far exceeding anything under Somoza. Freedom of speech and press is more restricted today than it was under Somoza. So as bad as he was, and as much as I would have been a revolutionary in 1979, what has been fastened upon the Nicaraguan people since is much, much worse. And if it is consolidated thoroughly, and if its opposition is effectively neutralized, then the tyranny of that regime will only get worse.
In the second part of my question, and I really want to extend this beyond the borders of Nicaragua, and I also want to tell the viewers that you've traveled to many parts of the world, many countries. Many people in this country do not take time, either they be conservative or liberal, to discuss this problem and its resolution. Oftentimes because of a dictatorial government that's in power, a military government in particular, and there is a suppression of the people, there is illiteracy, there is poverty, and many of us believe that sows the seeds for a Marxist government to start a revolution in the hills that results in victory in the capital of the country. As someone who's traveled a lot and has a lot of expertise, what advice would you give the government of the United States and the advisors to the president on how we find some way in these countries that are looking for development and with people in the country that have desire for a democratic form of government, to find some way as a third alternative between these two systems that you've described?
That's a very good question. You know, taking a country from dictatorship to democracy is not a science, and there's no book that says here are the steps that you must follow, and each country is very different. We've had some success in easing the way for democracy in the Philippines, in South Korea. What looked like a success in Haiti may turn out yet to not have been a success. Certainly we were a late bloomer, if an activist at all, in Iran, and that didn't work out very well. So it's very tricky. But in the case of Nicaragua, I think the U.S. ought to be working very closely with the Organization of American States for a regional effort to aid in a transition from Sandinista dictatorship to post-war democratic Nicaragua. I don't see how the U.S. could effectively bring about that transition without the close cooperation of other countries in the region, and specifically the other neighbors of Nicaragua in Central America. They have to be involved, and I think to a great degree have been. They've been leaders in that respect. So the long and short of it is to involve the other countries, the other democracies in the region, work closely with them, and then as quickly as possible open the borders for free trade with a democratic regime in Nicaragua, should that happen.
Larry, do you think it's necessary that when you're trying to create this fragile system, that international organizations from outside should be invited in to, one, encourage a multi-political party system and supervise elections, and have some transition period in which that new experiment will have a chance?
Yes, I think that's an advisable path. The Contra opposition to the Sandinistas has made it quite plain that if that they would support international supervision of free and democratic elections in the country, whether they are victorious against the Sandinistas or if some resolution of the whole conflict arises because of the peace plan. Either way, I think you'd find broad support even within Nicaragua for international involvement and cooperation and association with a democratic process. And I think that would be vital.
Michael Miller.
We're all frequently hearing the Sandinista government described as a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship in the American media. And yet I'm wondering what kind of Marxism it is we have here. We have a supposedly Marxist country in which more than half of the economy remains in private hands. There's reasonable freedom of religion, and a Roman Catholic cardinal sits on the Sandinista government. And more to the point, they have a National Assembly that's composed of 96 seats, 35 of which are occupied by members of two opposition parties. The government was elected in 1985 in an internationally supervised election that was declared free and fair by teams of international observers. If these people are Marxists, they appear not to have read their Lenin very closely. To what extent can we really begin to castigate the Sandinistas as a totalitarian regime?
I would say they're very clever Marxists. They've obviously fooled you. Let me go point by point down the list of things that you've mentioned. And incidentally, it isn't just right-wingers who refer to this government as Marxist. Bayardo Arce, one of the 9 commandantes, has made it quite plain on more than one occasion, saying that Marxism, Leninism, and Sandinismo are inseparable. Even outgoing Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill said that Daniel Ortega was a bumbling, incompetent Marxist-Leninist communist. Those are Tip O'Neill's words, and he's certainly no supporter of American policy in that part of the world. You mentioned the economy, and I've often heard this remark from Witness for Peace people and others that over half of the economy is private. I would suggest, Michael, that you pay a visit to Managua and talk to some of these so-called private business people. And there you'll discover that virtually all wages, all prices, are strictly controlled by the Sandinista government. Sure, you have a piece of paper that says this farm is yours, but the government tells you that you must sell its production to the government at government fixed prices. And when you tell that farmer, but hey, you've got a private piece of land here, this is your farm, he'd be surprised to hear that. So it's one thing to say that somebody has a piece of paper that says this is their farm. It's quite another to say that that's private when, in fact, virtually every aspect of it, production and distribution and pricing, is controlled by the government. Concerning the presence of a National Assembly, many Marxist governments of the world maintain at least the image of some democracy. They have an assembly of sorts. Question is, do they have free elections that send opponents, if the people so vote, to that assembly? The election that supposedly validated that National Assembly were in '84, incidentally, not '85, November of '84. They were supervised in a few instances at some ballot boxes by some foreign groups, many of which had a left-wing agenda and were anxious to say that this, in fact, was a fair election. The problem was that 2/3 of the precincts had no other party or other observer beyond the Sandinista representatives there to monitor the ballot box. But I have to remind you that the test of a free election isn't just what happens at the ballot box. It's what happens in the process leading up to the election. And there you'll find that the Sandinistas had a stranglehold on the media. The opposition parties had virtually no opportunity to make their case. Sandinista-led mobs were unleashed to beat up on those involved in opposition rallies and the distribution of literature. They had virtually no access to the media. Arturo Cruz, the main opponent of the Sandinista government, had to withdraw from the election before it was even held because of the harassment, the intimidation, and the lack of a free process. And there are many other such events I could point to. But let me mention this. After the election, there was not a single Latin American leader other than Fidel Castro who dignified Ortega's inauguration by showing up for it. And specifically, President Carlos Perez of Venezuela, who had been a supporter of the Sandinistas, helped them come to power in 1979, declared that he would not go to Ortega's inauguration to dignify those sham elections. The New York Times, hardly a right-wing paper, said that only the naive believe that those were free and fair elections. The Washington Post said the same thing. The Paris paper Le Monde said that these are not elections that deserve to be dignified. The foreign minister of Venezuela said that these were a sham process and that without liberty, elections are meaningless. Those elections were meant to consolidate power. The Sandinista commandantes themselves are on record as saying that beforehand, that elections are a nuisance. They're not about the contest for power, because there is no contest for power in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas shall hold it. So I would dispute very strongly what you've said about those elections.
Let me pursue a point that is related to the issue of elections and different models of organization of the state and perhaps the Sandinista affinity for Marxism. Would it not, if we looked at the historical record, be more accurate to represent the current phase of evolution of Nicaraguan society as the latest manifestation of a historic struggle, which is based in nationalistic and patriotic sentiments? And by that I mean, if we look at the historical record, we see that U.S. invasion of Nicaragua and the Nicaraguans' resistance to those military incursions preceded the very existence of the Soviet Union by 54 years. When we went into Nicaragua, it was very much to preserve what you call free market. And yet we find that the Soviets...
Oh, no, wait a minute. Before you're really spinning out some fallacies here. We did not intervene to preserve a free market. There wasn't a free market. There were family dynasties and dictatorial controls, and if you call that a free market, well then okay, I'm not a free market economist.
Let's pursue that for a minute. And you've recognized the existence of these elite oligarchies, the people who control the latifundia, and that very small proportion of national resources, and especially agricultural, industrial resources, are owned by the average Nicaraguan. Mm-hmm. So would your position be that we must find some way to reform the oligarchic structure, and are there democratic mechanisms for doing that? Are these people going to give something up because in fact that's what you're proposing?
Well, of course, there's no meaningful reform toward freer markets taking place under the Sandinistas. You've simply replaced one band of dynastic rulers with another that are far more brutal than what came before. So yes, I certainly favor reform along free market lines, which would allow Nicaragua to develop without these family monopolies taking place. I think also we need to point out that, to be honest with history, that although I personally would have opposed American intervention, it didn't come without the invitation of important segments of Nicaraguan society. In fact, A.C. Sandino, from whom the Sandinistas have taken their name, and this is widely been documented in Shirley Christian's book, Nicaragua Revolution in the Family, goes into this in some detail. A.C. Sandino, on more than one occasion, demanded that American troops come into Nicaragua. He wanted them out sooner than they wanted to go, and then turned against them, but he nonetheless was one of many Nicaraguans who demanded intervention to bring order out of the chaos in Nicaragua.
So if we pursue I think your basic assumption is that free market mechanisms would enhance the movement of Nicaragua towards democracy. How do we deal with that oligarchic structure? And to complete the sentence, those markets would be free for whom to do what? To whom?
Free markets mean that government doesn't say to someone, if you want to accumulate wealth through production and trade, we will not confiscate what you produce. The fruits of your labor will be yours. And furthermore, you can trade with whom you want on the terms that you wish, and you cannot use the government to prevent someone else from competing with you. That kind of an arrangement has been widely employed with great success in various parts of the world, most notably right next door in Costa Rica. So the region does not have a lack of a history of free markets. Now, Costa Rica isn't a perfectly free one, but they are much freer than anything Nicaragua has ever known, and they are a very similar culture. I think there again, freer markets and a democratic process have to be a part of the transition that would be supervised by the Organization of American States. I don't think it can be imposed upon Nicaragua. in a post-Sandinista situation. I think it would have to come about through the OAS, the neighbors in the region, in cooperation with those in Nicaragua who favor democracy.
Larry, I want to have a little time on the program to identify who the Contras are. And in your presentation today, you've done that. There have been some charges that the Contras are almost solely consist of the National Guard prior to Ortega and the government that he represents. I would like for you to do two things, if you would, please. One is to identify who you think makes up basically the Contras, and then give us a little description of how they and the government's forces are battling and who has control of what parts of the country.
Okay. This myth that the Contras can simply be dismissed as a remnant of Somoza's National Guard is put forth by people typically who never spent a day with them, but who have an interest because of their agenda in painting them as being thugs or guardsmen who should be dismissed. The numbers don't add up. At the height of Somoza's National Guard, by 1979, they numbered some 10,000 people. The Contras today number at least 17,000. Of the 10,000 which comprised Somoza's National Guard before the revolution, 2,000 to 3,000 of them are presently still in Sandinista jails. Several thousand others were either killed or expelled, or they left the country, they're in hiding, they're not in Contra ranks. If you look at the average age of a Contra soldier today, it's 19 to 21, which means that those people were not even teenagers when Somoza was overthrown. As the New York Times is beginning to report and the Washington Post, these tend to be Nicaraguan peasants, not the middle class or the upper classes. They've long since fled. These are ordinary Nicaraguans who object to being persecuted, who object to having their churches harassed, who believed in the promises of the Sandinistas in 1979 when they said they favored freedom and free elections, only to see those promises broken. This is a legitimate indigenous uprising of Nicaraguans. It would be there if the U.S. had never given them a dime. And
so you indicate there's about 17,000, and then you've indicated in the government there's, what, a force of about 65,000?
That's right, 65,000 men under arms. The big difference there is that that's a conscripted army of 65,000 men who had no choice. The Contras can't conscript, they can't draft, and they would be at a loss on the battlefield if they had to rely on draftees anyway.
The reason I'm rushing is because of the time, but can you also identify some of the strongholds for both within the country now? Okay,
the Sandinistas, of course, are still very much in charge along the populous Pacific coast, where most of their forces are concentrated. But now in 10 or 12 of the 16 provinces, we have the Contras actively contesting government control. Whole provinces now are becoming increasingly dominated by the Contras. The Wall Street Journal ran a story about Chontales province, only a 2-hour drive from Managua, that now has become so unsafe for the Sandinistas that they have stopped bringing in food and boots and clothing because the people, when they get their hands on them, immediately turn them over to the Contras. They've stopped flying their force of Soviet helicopter gunships into Chontales because they get shot down. The Contras have shown amazing, broad-based, popular support, which has allowed them to become a significant battlefield force in only the past several months. And this isn't just me speaking. This is the New York Times, the Washington Post, reporters from a number of major American papers who have begun to actually spend time with them in the field, observing their relationships with the peasants and their military activity. And they are enjoying enormous, spectacular success.
One quick final point before I go back to Michael. The atrocities we've heard about in the media for the Contras, I know in Civil War you get those, and that doesn't justify them, but it happened in the Civil War in the United States. Can you identify or take a position that both of the Contras and the government, are they both engaging in atrocities with, in these battles with the civilian population?
There have been atrocities on both sides, there's no question about it. The Independent Human Rights Commission has, for 1986, documented over 20 Contra atrocities, but nearly about 1,500 Sandinista atrocities. So it happens on both sides. But when you look at the Gallup poll of the people of the neighboring countries, which they were asked, well, who do you think treats the people better? In no country was the percentage less than 2/3 of the neighboring people saying that the Contras treat the people in Nicaragua far better than the Sandinistas. I think the fact that they have such broad popular base in central Nicaragua and in Zelaya, the eastern department, indicates that the atrocities which they have committed are minimal in number when compared with those that have sparked this rebellion on the part of the Sandinistas.
Michael.
Let me quote Edgar Chamorro, who was the director of the Nicaraguan Democratic Force from 1982 to 84. This is a top Contra leader speaking about the Contras. Former top Contra leader.
Right.
That's correct. He left in disgust.
And also a former Sandinista.
The Chamorro states that the Contras are the creation of the CIA, that no position, policy, or public pronouncement by Contra leadership has ever taken place without CIA control, that the CIA runs all of the Contras' public relations efforts and has orchestrated intimidation campaigns against U.S. congressmen, accusing them of being soft on communism if they don't support the Contras, that the record shows the CIA has worked closely with the Contras to develop manuals on civilian terror, and he stated in his article to the New Republic, quote, "It was standard Contra practice to kill prisoners and collaborators." And he quit after 2 years as part of the Contra Directorate, saying that, "I now believe that a political dialogue should be the U.S.'s top priority. The first step towards national reconciliation must be abolition of the Contra Army. And if the Contras ever took power, nobody would be better off." Now, these are the conclusions of an insider, of a person who's seen both sides of the fence. Why should we not believe him?
Well, an important point here is that one of the reasons that Chamorro left was that because it became quite apparent that he had direct and close ties with the Sandinista government. This is a guy who was working for the other side. This is the principal reason he left. You'll find plenty of Contras in the fields and Contra leaders who will tell you something different. But I would fully and readily admit that the CIA involvement with the Contras has been excessive and harmful in many respects. The CIA single-handedly botched the indigenous uprising of the Mosquito Indians.
Well,
so I don't apologize for
isn't
the
CIA direction absolutely the antithesis of an indigenous and authentic uprising? I mean, where do you find the CIA backing an indigenous and authentic national uprising?
This idea that the CIA directs every Contra activity of 17,000 men isolated across jungle territory in Nicaragua is absurd. The CIA has been very deeply involved, far more deeply than I would like to see it.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I wish we could continue. We're out of time. I want to thank you, Lawrence Reed, for being on our program. It's been most informative. Michael, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our program. Please be with us again next week at the same time. Until then, have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.